I'm Mark Krexler with theclimateweb.com, the closest thing to a collective intelligence for tackling climate change. This morning, as usual, checked my LinkedIn feed, saw this interesting post having to do with ZeroSix, a new era of carbon credits. Thought I would track that down a bit. So I jumped over to the news story describing this at carboncredits.com and come down to the brief discussion here about in the US, there are lots of wells that don't produce a lot of oil. They produce a very small fraction of US oil and gas, but they produce about 11% of annual methane emissions from oil and gas production, or about 280,000 tons of methane per year. And this was intriguing because I thought, well, maybe this project is about reducing methane leakage from these wells by shutting in the wells and then taking credit for reducing the methane leakage. But as you look in the next sentence, they're talking about this could, in the US, you could generate 1 billion tons of CO2 equivalent reductions per year from shutting in these wells, 280,000 tons of methane. If you use an approximate GWP of 20 for methane, you get roughly 6 million tons of CO2e. If you avoided those emissions, 6 million tons is a long way from 1,000 million tons. And so I was curious about what was really going on here. And so I decided to delve into the white paper for ZeroSix, which is available at their very fancy new website. So here's the cover of the white paper, 25-page white paper. ZeroSix, the digital solution for a new era of high quality carbon credits. Now, I'm not going to go through the white paper in order. I'm going to jump down to where they talk about exactly what they're thinking of doing. And then I'm going to come back to how they're integrating that or discussing that in the context of the voluntary carbon market and the criteria for the voluntary carbon market. So let's jump to page 19. So here we are at page 19, where they're discussing this 1 gigaton CO2e per year opportunity in the United States alone, which is a big number. And so they're talking about the United States had more than 930,000 wells, some 870,000 of them are producing less than 100 barrels of oil a day. And they describe a little bit what's really going on here. Some are producing less than a barrel of oil equivalent per day. And the reason for this is because a lot of the wells don't want to deal with the costs of shutting down and cleaning up the wells. So they continue operating the wells indefinitely until they can declare bankruptcy and go out of business and leave the wells for taxpayers to deal with. But on a climate action front, it says if we shut down the bottom 25% of these wells, we could avoid the emission of 1 billion tons of CO2e per year. So they are definitely talking about locking in the oil and gas in these wells. They're not talking about simply avoiding the emissions for these wells and talking about how make major progress closing the 23 gigaton gap between current emissions reductions and what's needed to reach the Paris Agreement aligned targets. But is that really true? Are these actually going to work as offsets? And so I'm going to jump back up into the early part of the paper to take a look at how they're talking about these reductions in the context of the voluntary offset market. Along the way, there's the obligatory language about it's time for a new era of high quality carbon credits. And along the way, there's the obligatory discussion of how greenwashing has been such a big problem in voluntary carbon markets and how the ZeroSix solution avoids and fixes the greenwashing problem. So now let's see how they're characterizing the problems with the voluntary carbon market that these credits are going to fix. And they quote the Rocky Mountain Institute that we must urgently restore trust in the market, ensuring the carbon credits are delivering high quality emission reductions and removals, et cetera, et cetera. So problem number one is accuracy, suggesting that the quantification of tons is a real challenge for voluntary carbon markets, which I would disagree with. That has not been a particularly large issue for the voluntary carbon market. The second criterion or problem that they refer to, additionality, as you may know, I do consider that a significant issue in the market today. And they are talking about how there are real problems with nature-based projects that are protecting forests that wouldn't have otherwise been cut down, et cetera. And what they're basically talking about here is that this oil and gas from these wells arguably would have been produced under a business as usual scenario, and that shutting in these wells is therefore additional. And if you assume that these wells would be allowed to produce indefinitely to avoid having to be cleaned up, and if you assume that they don't have to cap their methane emissions, if you assume all these things just continue as usual, which by the way is completely inconsistent with the idea of the Paris Agreement for a 1.5 or a 2 degree target. But if you assume those things, then it makes sense to say that these are additional reductions. Now, we'll keep going. Permanence. Permanence is a significant issue. And if you avoid the emission of a ton of fossil fuels for all practical purposes in today's world, since there's so much fossil fuel out there, it probably does satisfy the permanent standard. And they do talk a little bit about the problem that nature-based solutions have with permanence. The fourth criterion they talk about is transparency, and that gets into the whole blockchain aspect of this and tokenization of this, which frankly is neither here nor there in terms of whether this is a good offset or a bad offset. Now, those are the four problems they associate with the carbon market. You may notice that there's a variable missing here, and that is leakage. There are three key criteria for a carbon offset: additionality, permanence, and lack of leakage. And they never mention leakage. And probably makes sense in the sense that there's a real problem here, because when you talk about locking in a fossil fuel or fiber or anything else that is within a functioning commodity market, you're going to get leakage. If you shut down an oil well, if you shut down a coal mine, if you simply shut down a forest, the demand for that product is going to go somewhere else, and you're going to pump more oil, mine more coal, cut down more trees somewhere else. That's basic economics. And that's the issue of leakage. And that's why no one has ever really succeeded before in arguing that they should be able to shut down a coal mine or shut down an oil well or not develop it in the first place in order to get carbon credits, because you're going to have 100% leakage for all practical purposes. And so it can't be an offset. And yet they ignore the leakage issue, and therefore argue it's additional, it's permanent, it's transparent, and it's accurate, and therefore it's a high quality credit. Yet they're missing one of the three key variables for what an offset is. The topic of leakage is certainly not anything that is being hidden from anyone. If you go to the climate web and explore the topic of leakage, you can find the whole literature. Now, the literature on leakage, admittedly, is much smaller than the literature on additionality and on permanence. And most of the literature around leakage does deal with forestry projects. If you plant trees, if you protect trees, what happens somewhere else outside the project boundary? Does people not plant trees? Do people start harvesting trees they wouldn't have otherwise have harvested? So most of the leakage conversation is in that context. But if you're talking about shutting in oil wells, you're talking about massive leakage. And it's so obvious that no one has really actually had to write much about the issue. So the bottom line here is that I thought this might be a really interesting case if they were focusing on the methane emissions from these wells, and shutting down the wells would cause the emissions to go away. That could pose an interesting question for carbon offset purposes. Additional, permanent, arguably no leakage. You can raise some real questions about whether that makes sense in the context of the Paris agreements, because letting those wells continue to operate indefinitely just can't be part of achieving the Paris agreements. But in reality, that's not what they're talking about at all. They're talking about locking in oil and gas. They're talking about giving a credit, a ton of CO2 offset credit for every 2 barrels of oil that are left in the ground. And that just can't make any sense. There are billions of tons of oil in the ground. And if you start trying to compensate people for leaving oil on the ground, coal in the ground, gas in the ground, and justifying emissions somewhere else on that basis by selling offsets, that is just the road to perdition. It can't possibly make any sense. Hope that's useful.